Forget no insult, my sons, as I have never forgotten those of my father, of the Emperor, nor those of Horus. Forgive no slight or grievance. Hold your bitterness deep within you, and there let it fester. Let it roil and squirm and churn, until you are filled with bile so poisonous that all you touch falls to ruin. Thus shall you serve Nurgle best. Thus shall you spread his virulent gifts across the false Imperium, and watch its final rotting. The Primarchs of his Imperium, though demigods of humanity, would not be without flaws. Brashness, arrogance, and pride would mark the fall and disgrace of many of the Emperor's sons, for even in his most loyal champions, they would lay bare their most exploitable weaknesses in personality and resolve. For today, we shall elucidate a Primarch enshrined in bitterness and morose isolation. The Primarch of the 14th Legion, Mortarion. During the scattering of the Primarchs, the 14th child of the Emperor would be transported to the death world of Barbarus. Wreathed in deadly toxins, the steam-fueled contraptions of the planet would heavily influence the demeanor and temperament of the Primarch's personality. The populace would be ruled by inhuman necromancers empowered by the influence of chaos, whilst Barbarus's human inhabitants would attempt to farm the land for a meager existence within the small pockets of the world not sullied by poison. Constantly wary of the creatures spawned by the necromantic overlords of the planet, the humans would toil in ignorance as the Primarch's gestation pod would be discovered. Among the ceaseless battlefields between the overlords of Barbarus, one such tyrant would discover a child among the corpses of the war zone. Perplexed at the child's tolerance to the noxious air of the land, the Overlord would find the infant screaming among the dead. The High Overlord, Nekar, would see an opportunity for his superhuman foundling to become the heir to his legacy. Naming the child Mortarion, or Child of Death in Barbaran native dialect, the Primarch of the 14th would be housed within a small tower enveloped in the planet's toxic fumes. The High Overlord of Barbarus would diligently build his own lair within the most toxic peak of the planet's mountains. Mortarion's superhuman resistance to poison and disease would be pushed to its limit as the maturing child's lungs fought desperately to filter the miasma with every breath. Gifted with a voracious hunger for knowledge, Mortarion would be tutored by his captor in all manner of battle doctrines and arcane arts. Yet as the child matured, his mind would come to question the lot of Barbarus's human populace and the manner in which they would be treated. Questions which would go unanswered should the young Primarch remain in captivity. Escaping his tower of isolation, Mortarion would fell any guard whom attempted to stand in his path. Venturing to the valleys of Barbarus, Mortarion's tolerance for poisons would allow him to survive the noxious mists. Finding the human populace to be of his own species, Mortarion would realize his kinship with the oppressed people of the poisonous world. Slow to trust the Primarch, the Barbarans would see the child of the mountains to be an unnatural interloper into their ranks. Such opinions would be short-lived with the Primarch's defense of the settlement from the attack of a horrific creature. Dispatched by a rival overlord of the necromancers, the settlers would stand little chance of defending themselves from the monster's rampage. Yet with the intervention of Mortarion, armed with a large harvesting scythe, the monster would be slain. The necromancer overlord would smirk at the upstart defender of Barbarus as he retreated back into the poison mists, yet would be shocked as the Child of Death charged into the noxious fumes and cleaved him in two with his scythe. Championed by the people of Barbarus, Mortarion would use his knowledge, bequeathed from his foster father, to reinforce the settlements of the valleys. Creating strongholds and traveling from settlement to settlement, Mortarion would transform the disorganized and vulnerable citizens into a resistance militia. Recruiting the most durable and bold men of the settlements into a band of warriors, Mortarion would train his lieutenants, capable of leading small battalions. incorporating artificers and blacksmiths to create weapons and armor for his men. Mortarion's band would soon be equipped to venture into the poisoned wastes of the world and fight at his side. His so-called Death Guard would battle against the hordes of the necromancers, and with each victory, hone their martial prowess and adapt their armor to endure ever-increasingly deadly environments. Besting the overlords of the planet, only one trial would stand in their way before the world of Barbarus would be rid of the malevolent curse of its ruling tyrants. Mortarion's foster father, Nekar, and his fortress within the most deadly peak of the mountains. Assembling his men to assault the fortress of the High Overlord, Mortarion would be conflicted in waging war against his father figure. Under the advisement of his most trusted advisor, Callus Typhon, the Death Guard would call off their assault of the stronghold of the Necromancer. Their armor would not be capable of surviving the deadly peak of the mountains until further advancements could be made. As such, Mortarion would withdraw his people to their village, yet on their return, be informed of the arrival of a peculiar stranger to their settlement, promising salvation. Confronting the stranger as he sat in conference with the elders of the village, Mortarion would balk at the insinuation that he was capable of liberating his people unaided. Offering Mortarion a challenge, the stranger would give the ultimatum that he would intervene if the champion of Barbarus would be unable to defeat the High Overlord. Should the stranger lend his might, Mortarion would swear fealty to him, yet should Mortarion free his people unaided, the stranger would leave the planet. Alone, Mortarion would venture to the stronghold of his foster father, despite the protestation of his Death Guard. Seeking to prove the stranger wrong, the Child of Death would attempt to breach the thick smog of toxins surrounding the High Overlord's fortress. Mortarion's armor began to rust and fragment with every step closer to his prize. Yet as Mortarion reached the gates of the Overlord's citadel, he would collapse. Nekar would stand outside the gates of his citadel and mock the Child of Death for his weakness. Within Mortarion's mind, a whisper of a being of malicious intent would resound. The being known as Nurgle had delighted in Mortarion's circumstance and began his slow influence within his mind. Nekar would attempt to end the Primarch's life, yet before delivering the fatal blow, the stranger to the village would intervene. Slaying the High Overlord with his sword wreathed in flame, the stranger would save the life of the Child of Death. Recovering from the ordeal, Mortarion would, true to his word, pledge his fealty to his revealed true father, the Emperor. Granting Mortarion command of the 14th Legion, the Dusk Raiders, it would not be long before the Primarch would incorporate his barbarian warriors into the Legion's ranks and rename them the Death Guard. Yet despite the Emperor's salvation of his homeworld and the death of its tyrannical overlord, Mortarion's pride would be irrevocably damaged. Denied vengeance against his life's tormentor, Mortarion would bear a grudge against the master of mankind which would never heal. With time, the slight submerged deep within his psyche would be nurtured and exploited by the plague god, Nurgle. For Mortarion's descent into the thrall of chaos had already begun. Rallying his new legion and restructuring its ranks to reflect his homeworld's cultural trappings, Mortarion would be a striking figure to his Terran-born Astartes. The manifestation of the ancient Terran figure of the Grim Reaper, the Lord of Death would utter a simple axiom to his legion. "You are my unbroken blades. You are the Death Guard. By your hand shall justice be delivered, and doom shall stalk 1,000 worlds." Striking fear into the hearts of the Imperium's foes, the 14th Legion would trudge a relentless path of destruction in the Emperor's name. Drafting recruits exclusively from Barbarus, the Terran cultural heritage within the Legion would erode with time. Creating tension within the Legion, as the Great Crusade waged on, the Terran Astartes of the 14th would dwindle. The Death Guard would bring compliances to the Imperium with the fervor of liberation. Never pausing their crusade, as each world fell to their scythes, the Death Guard would resupply their might in transit to their next objective. Never reinforcing or garrisoning worlds brought into their compliance, the Death Guard would sow death and reap their harvest of souls. Fueled by a desire to cleanse humanity of terror and oppression, Mortarion's campaigns would be waged without mercy or restraint. Often waging joint campaigns with his brother Primarch, Horus Lupercal, the Death Guard and the Lord of Death would gain a reputation as a reliable and efficient legion. Weakening their foes with their sheer fortitude in battle, the Death Guard would drain their opposition of firepower until the 16th Legion, the Lunar Wolves, would deliver the hammer blow to destroy their ranks. A close bond would form between Horus and Mortarion, despite the Lord of Death's visage of breathing apparatus and pallid skin, resulting in the majority of his Primarch brethren to distance themselves from his favour. Deemed a freakish figure among the sons of the Emperor, with exception given to the Night Haunter of Nostramo, Mortarion would be criticised by his brothers, such as the Primarch of the Ultramarines Legion, Rabute Guilliman, for cherishing his brotherhood of Horus above even the Emperor's grace. For in time, such a criticism of the Lord of Death's character would be proven to be true. As the Great Crusade began to draw to a close, the use of Psykers within the Legiones Astartes would begin to cause concern within the Imperium. The Librarius had proven time and again to be a tool of great power among the legions, yet their reliance of drawing power from the unstable depths of the warp would be called into question. Convening the Council of Nicaea, Primarchs and Astartes alike would debate on the use of Psykers within the Astartes ranks. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, would champion their inclusion, whilst Mortarion would seek to abolish their continual use. The Lord of Death's childhood had been plagued by the influence of foul sorcery, and shown Mortarion firsthand the depths and depravity that those who wielded psychic powers could stoop. Convincing the Emperor to disband the Librarius, Mortarion would be satisfied with his father's decision to outlaw sorcery within the legions. Yet such a victory to his ideals and values would not be enough to absolve the Emperor of the Lord of Death's resentment. The War Master of the Imperium, Horus Lupercal, would begin his descent into the clutches of chaos with the intervention of the Plague God. Wounded by the anaphane blade, wielded by the corrupted planetary governor, Eugen Temba, the chosen pawn of Nergaleth would injure the Primarch of the 16th Legion and allow for his corruption by the forces of chaos. Now poised to overthrow the galaxy with his rebellion to the throne, the War Master would turn to his trusted brother for allegiance. Mortarion had never been accepted by the Emperor, nor his most lauded sons, save for Horus. The War Master would reveal to Mortarion that the Emperor had stolen power from the beings of the Warp, and empowered himself through their means to become the most powerful Psyker of the galaxy. Mortarion's intolerance of Psykers would cement his resolve to face the Emperor, and alongside the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard would join in their betrayal. The Death Guard's path to damnation had been set, for even among their ranks, the seeds of corruption had been planted. First Captain Kalas Typhon had concealed his surrender to the ruinous powers, and with the influence of his rank, sown the influence of the Plague God into the 14th Legion. Upon the Istvan system, the traitor legions would begin their campaign to conquer the Imperium. Purging the loyalist remnants within their legions, the Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, and Death Guard would slaughter their brethren. The lingering glories of the Dusk Raiders would be expunged from the ranks of the Death Guard, and despite the escape of the Legion's battle captain, Nathaniel Garrow, and a detachment of loyalist Death Guard, the 14th submission to chaos would begin. Deploying his men to aid in the betrayal of the loyalist counterattack during the Istvan V Dropsite massacre, Mortarion would not linger to indulge in the grudges perpetrated by his traitorous brothers. Without delay, the Lord of Death would venture to attempt to bring another legion into the fold of the traitor war effort. Horus had been especially close to the Primarch of the White Scars, Jagatai Khan, during the Great Crusade, and as such, the Lord of Death would use this bond to bring the Khan of Khans into the fold. Absent from the opening stages of the Horus heresy, the 5th Legion had not pledged their blades to either side of the conflict. Refusing to intervene by aiding the Space Wolves within the Alaxis Nebula in the wake of the burning of Prospero, the White Scars would travel to the homeworld of the Thousand Suns to find answers. Confronting the Warhawk within the ashen derelicts of Prospero, the Lord of Death would offer the Khan an invitation to join their rebellion against the Emperor. Observing Mortarian's changes gifted by the ruinous powers, Jaghatai would surmise that the Pale King merely sought to expunge every trace of Psykers from the galaxy. Having drafted the outlines of the Librarius alongside his brothers Magnus and Sanguinius, the Khan, though not gifted with psychic power, would be sympathetic to those who were gifted with such abilities. Despite the restraint suggested by the White Scars and the Emperor's decision to outlaw the use of the Librarius, the traitors had surrendered to the beings of the Warp, and for such flagrant hypocrisy, the Warhawk would refuse to side with the Lord of Death. Warning Mortarion that the Warp shall claim him should he continue on his path, Mortarion had chosen to betray humanity for the promise of strength and found his rewards wanting. The Kargan would state that the Primarchs were not empire builders, for only the Emperor could be capable of leading humanity. Enraged at the Khan's refusal to join the traitor legions, Mortarion and his Death Guard would battle the White Scars and their Primarch. The Keshig and Death Shroud would clash as the sons of the Emperor circled one another. The Death Lord and Kargan would clash, their blows matching one another in a battle between speed and constitution. Yet with the arrival of the Death Guard fleet above Prospero, Mortarion would retreat from the fray. With the Second Battle of Prospero ended and his attempt to recruit the 5th Legion failed, Mortarion would command his fleet to purge the planets of the Prosperine system. For the Lord of Death sought answers within the bones of the Crimson King's empire. Upon the Mandeville Point during 007.M31, Mortarion would descend upon the world and capture one of its inhabitants. Possessed by a demon of the Warp, the captive woman shackled within the Death Guard flagship, Endurance, would reveal its nature to Mortarion. Having never encountered such a being, the Pale King would be taunted by the possessed woman's insinuation that his soul had been claimed by the Lord of Decay. His intolerance of the Warp further stoked, Jaghatai's words had been proven true, for Mortarion was now surrounded by the servants of fell gods. Alone in his resolve to stave off the influence of chaos among the traitor ranks, Mortarion would seek the means to prevent his damnation. Yet the power of Nurgle would not be denied, for Mortarion had not been chosen. He had been claimed. Believing himself to be incorruptible, the possessed woman would mock the Primarch's self-delusion and hypocrisy. Transforming into a being of the Immaterium, the demon would taunt the Lord of Death as he struggled and failed to crush it with his raw strength. Forced to unleash his innate yet repressed psychic abilities buried deep within, Mortarion would rend the demon apart. Mockingly saluting the Primarch with the phrase, "Hail, Master of the Plague," as its soul receded back into the Immaterium, it would leave the Lord of Death in his state of hypocrisy. Now empowered with the very sorceries he had always denied, Mortarion would acknowledge his self-loathing nature and attempt to master the Warp to prevent becoming its pawn. The Death Guard Legion would become fragmented with the first captain's continual fascination and pursuit of the powers of the Chaos Gods. Already tutored in the arts of sorcery by the Wordbearer's first chaplain, Erebus, Typhon would not repress nor hide his own psychic abilities. Mortarion would order his legion to aid in the assault of the Siege of Terror, yet callous Typhon now no longer served the whims of his Primarch. Surrendering his soul, men and vessels, to the clutches of Nurgle within the Immaterium, the splintering of the Death Guard by its first captain had begun. Murdering the navigators of the fleet, Typhon would allow the fleet under Mortarion's command to be soaked in the powers of Nurgle within the Immaterium. Unable to escape the Warp, the Astartes of the fleet would transform into bloated, pus-coated beings, their rusted armor and rotten flesh ripe for the many contagions and viruses to grow plump within their seeping wounds and rotten skin. Mortarion would not be spared such gifts of the Plague God, nor once more be saved by the Emperor's grace. Mortarion would endure untold suffering and transform until the gifts of Nurgle would cease. Reborn as a demon prince of the Plague Father, Mortarion would pledge his soul and the fate of his legion as a bargain of his deliverance from pain. Returning to real space as horrific harbingers of disease and pestilence, the Death Guard would join the traitor assault of the Siege of Terra. Descending as the first assault wave upon the throne world and slaughtering swathes of the defenders of the Imperium, Mortarion and his Death Guard would wreak havoc. Conquering the Colossi Gate, the Death Guard would redeploy to the Marmax Bastion and once again face the Warhawk and his White Scars in battle. Mortarion's outcast Geneson, Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow, would intervene and alongside his Knights Errant confront his Genefather. Offering Garrow the chance to rejoin his legion, the Hand of the Sigillite would reject the corrupted Primarch's offer and before perishing, wound Mortarion with his broken blade, Libertas. Capturing the Lionsgate spaceport from Imperial forces, Jaghatai would engage Mortarion in the battle to reclaim the vital linchpin of the Throne World's defense. Once again dueling, Jaghatai would be no match against the now fully empowered pawn of Chaos, yet the Kargan knew a weakness he could exploit. Scolding Mortarion's weakness of giving himself to the entities of the Warp, the Kargan would strike a crippling blow to the Lord of Death's ego. Taking advantage of Mortarion's frenzied state, Jaghatai would injure the Lord of Death before being impaled by Mortarion's scythe, Silence. Pulling himself close to Mortarion, Jaghatai would endure the pain of the blade as it dug deep into his flesh and decapitate the Pale King. Banished into the roiling tides of the Warp, Mortarion would materialize once more into the mortal realm and claim dominion of a demon world. Residing on the Plague Planet, the disgraced Lord of Death would not show his presence within the Imperium for many millennia. His Plague Marines of the 14th had failed during the Siege of Terra, and the Horus Heresy had been thwarted by the Emperor and the Loyalists to the throne. Ruling his world as a tyrant alike to his foster father, the hypocrisy of Mortarion would ascend new heights as he ruled the world as a tyrannical overlord. Ascending fully into the form of a demon prince, Mortarion would rule his kingdom as the Death Guard splintered into warbands of varying loyalties. Yet with the dawn of the 41st millennium, the Pale King would return to real space. During 901.M41, Mortarion would slay the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, Cornavin, and be banished by his successor, Kaldor Drago. Carving his predecessor's name onto Mortarion's heart, Mortarion would temporarily be banished once more to the Immaterium. However, the birth of the Cicatrix Maledictum across the stars would herald a new dawn for the Death Guard. The Great Rift would demand opposition, and with the return of the Avenging Sun, Rebute Guilliman, Mortarion would wage his great plague war upon Ultramar. Seeking to corrupt Macragge and its subordinate planets and spread the Garden of Nurgle across the bones of their ravaged husks, the Pale King would be confronted by the Ultramarines and their Primarch. Dueling Guilliman upon the world of Ajax in single combat, the culmination of the Plague Wars would see Mortarion slay the Primarch of the 13th. Resurrected by the Emperor, through Guilliman, the Master of Mankind would banish Mortarion once more and deal a wound upon the Plague God, Nurgle. His garden burning and champion defeated, Nurgle would be displeased with his chosen Primarch as he tends to his wounded pride and ambition. Yet one day, the Prince of Decay shall return, to wreak untold miseries upon the galaxy.
Now I do not accuse my brother of such barbarism, but no evil begins with such monstrous acts. If it did, no sane man would ever consider it. No, it begins slowly, a small step here, a small step there. By such acts is a man's heart turned black and rotten. A man may begin with noble intentions, believing that such small trespasses are minor things compared to the good he will do at the end of his course. But every act matters, from the smallest to the greatest. This has been a tale of the great Imperium of Man. read by the Remembrancer. The Lord of Death would be born into a world of misery, bereft of hope and virtue. Disgusted at the powers of the Immaterium, Mortarion's hypocrisy in embracing its influence would damn him for eternity. For in my next transmission, we shall elucidate another wayward son of the Emperor, whom would have no qualm with harnessing its power. The Crimson King of Prospero, Magnus the Red.